All right, so like I said, today we are going to be doing this section on alertness. So last week we talked about peace and joy as components of the spiritual perspective that we are to hold as Christians. And sort of how it's difficult for us to hold on to these things given all the difficulties and trials of life. So this is just another component. If I go up to the top of the study here, we're in this wider section here on the spiritual perspective. And so we have all these components here that go into sort of the proper mindset for us to adopt as we go through life as Christians. And this week, we're going to be focusing especially on this idea of alertness. Now, something that's probably a good place for us to start, just putting it into context in the wider analogy that has been used here. So early on in the study here, we had the metaphor of sort of military, like us as Christian soldiers and the military metaphor. And alertness on battlefields is excessively important, right? And so the initial stages of the metaphor were dealing with like training, just how military units need training. So too, we as Christians have to grow to maturity, and then we sort of face the trials of life, the get shot at, so to speak. And that's how we grow up as Christians. But honestly, the metaphor is quite good because it carries right over here as well. Given the situation in which we find ourselves in this spiritual battle, remaining alert, a very good way of thinking about it is remaining alert on the battlefield that we face spiritually, just as soldiers remain alert on a physical battlefield. So I don't think the section actually explicitly makes this point. This was just one of the things that I was thinking of just starting us off in how we think about this issue, because it sort of situates us in the wider context of what we've talked about before. And so we only have this one section this week, but it's reasonably long. And, I, as usual, have several points here. Abby, I actually think you mentioned this last week, the idea of spiritual momentum. But
yeah.
So we can go ahead and start here. You guys are welcome to comment on the point I just made with the alertness as a tie into the military metaphor. Of course, I guess another good area to point out is this is not the only place on the site that this idea of alertness is discussed. It's a very big theme of the Coming Tribulation series. I don't know which section, probably the one right preceding the tribulation, right? Like, where we have in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, right before Jesus starts talking about the end times, we have the parable of the fig trees, right? And there's the verse, no one knows the day or the hour, right? And, as Dr. Luganville sort of tongue-in-cheek points out in the email postings, that doesn't mean we don't know the month and the year, right? So the point of the fig tree parable is that we are to pay attention as Christians, sort of read the signs of the time, so to speak. And so alertness is, aside from the sort of alertness, and I think he might actually mention this explicitly. I don't know. I won't really spend the time to go and search for it, but I think he does make the distinction that what's being discussed in this section is the excuse me, the sort of day-to-day alertness rather than the eschatological kind. But the parallel for our alertness as it relates to paying attention to signs of the end times and the sort of wider geopolitical things that are going to go down once the restraint of the Holy Spirit is lifted and things like this. That's another parallel that is good for us to pull in to sort of give context to maybe not the idea in quite the same way as it shows up in this section, but like the idea of alertness in general for our lives as Christians. So thoughts on the initial things that I've talked about?
I was just reading, and I was reading Dr. Luganbill's this same study earlier
Uh-huh.
today, but a different section. And I don't know, he must have said something earlier in that section about something, along these same lines. And I was just thinking about how, like, if you don't regularly have your, like, nose in the Bible and you're listening to the Bible, reading the Bible, doing Bible study, you really do start to think the way the world thinks. Like, it's
Hmm.
like your mind, because I mean, if you think about it, you turn on the radio, it's worldly. You turn on the TV, it's all worldly. Even like your loved ones, because a lot of our loved ones, maybe aren't as growing, or they're not as committed to God as they should be. Even if they're Christian, they're going to be talking about worldly things. I know, like in my household, people are talking about politics all the time. So like, it's so easy just to start to think along those lines. You really do act. You have to be like vigilant and alert every day. And I'm realizing too, like the days that I get up and I don't start the day off like putting my nose in God's word, or start to think at the beginning of the day before anything else happens about God, um, those are the days where I get more like I start to lose that spiritual momentum, and it's harder to do Bible study later in the day. Like I'm starting to get into like worrying about politics or worrying about relationships and situations and things and then those things kind of just eat up my time and my energy. And it's, yeah, like I said, it's even harder to get back into God's word.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly this paragraph here. I mean, I can go find it in the study itself, but it's a really, really important concept because, spiritual momentum is sort of like the positive end of it, but the negative end of it is probably what we'd call hardening the heart, right? Um, so the more we give into sin, we go on this negative downward spiral. Um, and downward spiral meaning, negative feedback loop, right? Like, so how this tends to play out in practice is positive, I don't know, behavior sounds like too much like a psychology, like positive choices on our part, positive habits will sort of coalesce into a sort of feedback loop that leads us into thinking more spiritually, acting more spiritually. Um, like it's just this positive. I think Dr. Luganbill often calls this the virtuous cycle, right? And the flip side is true as well. So when we turn away from God, um, and harden our hearts, usually in practice, this starts by giving into sin, right? So not struggling against it, but sort of surrendering ourselves to it. That creates a negative feedback loop, this downward spiral, and both sides are true. Now, I included this other point. Actually, I don't think he talks about it in this section explicitly, but I know Ichthus, makes this point multiple places. This idea that there is no sitting still in the Christian life, right? So, in terms of our progress, either we're going forwards or backwards, and like there's no sitting on your hands, sort of avoiding combat completely, so to speak. And well, I mean, like that's the general idea, and like you mentioned, I think a good way of thinking about this initially is just how much time do we spend every day considering these things, and do we like situate ourselves, throughout the day in terms of God's truth, or do we just like lump it all at the end? So something I found is that if I set aside a block of time and say, you know what, okay, I'm going to read my Bible and do Bible study at this time, and I put all the time like all at once, like let's say maybe 2.5 hours after dinner or something, so from maybe like 6 o'clock, or not six, like 7 o'clock to 9:30 or something, then like I'll keep everything in this nice box. Like it's my Bible study time, and then I compartmentalize. Like I'm not doing this intentionally, right? But it's much easier to sort of say, okay, you know what, that's my Christian spot, and then the rest of my life is sort of separate. And of course, that's not how we ought to live as Christians, right? We shouldn't be like, okay, this is my Bible time, and then the rest of the day is me time, where I can sort of keep God in His box and um, like not deal with that aspect of our lives as Christians, but sort of compartmentalize it and keep it separate from our day-to-day living. I find that I have a hard time avoiding that if I don't intentionally like split up aspects of what we're called to as Christians throughout the day. So maybe I pray over my lunch break, or read my Bible in the morning and do Bible study, sometime in the middle of the day, and then do more at night, or whatever. Just sort of keep yourself thinking about the Christian perspective more times throughout the day. I find for me that helps, like me keep my eyes focused on what we ought to as Christians. And if I try to block everything together, or even, this was a habit I had more in college when I had really big projects and stuff. Even block things, not every day, but maybe every few days, and say, you know what, okay, now I finally have free time. I turned in my programming assignments or whatever. So it's a Saturday, and now I'm going to go study my Bible for 5 hours straight. Well, it's the same effect, the same principle I just mentioned, like blocking stuff by day. But the more you do that, the more you say, okay, 4 days without God, 1 day with God, sort of thing. Like it just really shoots holes in your spiritual progress. John, you have any thoughts?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Coming back to the metaphor about relating this alertness to the military metaphor, I think given my background, that resonates with me. I think it'd be interesting to think about what the mission or missions are, because we think about people in the military, they have a mission.
Right.
So as Christians, we also have a mission, broadly defined. I mean, it's to do God's work. But that encompasses so much. It's, I think, important to think about, okay, what does a general in God's army, what is his mission, and what is a private? What is the mission of a private in God's army?
Yeah. I mean, and I think we've touched on this some before. The verse I have pulled up on the shared screen right now is, I come back to this quite a lot. These verses in 1 Corinthians 12, the later part of this chapter talks about the body of Christ in general. But this right here is talking about how even people with the same gifts can sort of have different callings, right? And so you use the idea of orders. So, you might say that if someone has like sort of their designation is like maybe an infantry rifleman, right? So that's what they do. Or you have a tank mechanic, or you have like a logistics person or whatever. And so they all have their duties and responsibilities in the military machine. And, then you have like the wider overarching military goals, right? So maybe, I can give an example from my experience working sort of on the logistics side at the Air Force, right? One of the projects we're working on is dealing with weapon system sustainment, right? So you have all these planes, you have all the F-22s and B-2s and whatnot, and you have to keep them in fighting shape to support the war fighters, right? And that's the sort of language they use. So where I was going with this was that, sure, there's these overarching goals for the military apparatus itself, but each of us, I'm a civilian, right? But the active duty guys too, like we all have our duties and responsibilities. And so too here, in these verses from 1 Corinthians, all of us as Christians have like specific marching orders, right? So these are the gifts that God has given us, and the talents we have, the natural aptitudes, and even based on our life experiences. Something that I've talked to several people with about is growing up in a specific sort of, what's the right word? It's not like bubble is maybe not the right word, but like I grew up, my parents are middle class. We grew up in these neighborhoods that were not particularly ethnically diverse, things like this. And I grew up sort of as a boring Protestant. I didn't have a super big rebellious period. Like I don't relate to people as well as individuals who have a different background, right? And so all this to say that we all have like our individual callings, and those can be different even for people with the same gifts, right? So different teachers can be called to different ministries. Maybe one does stuff on WhatsApp, Another one has their own website. Another one does stuff on YouTube. You get the idea. And then there's what we're called to as Christians, like maybe as the church, right? What are the missions and goals of the church? And that's something bigger than ourselves. So I don't know if you want to elaborate, John, on like, were you talking individual like marching orders versus that of like the corporate body of the church as a whole?
Yeah, I have quite a few thoughts on that. I think for one thing, if we think about the metaphor, comparing this to maybe altitude of airplanes, your view when you're flying at 30,000 feet is quite different from your view when you're flying at 500 feet, let's say in a helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
And so like a general would have a 30,000 foot view, and then your immediate supervisor would have the 500 foot view of what you do. And so our mission, I think, would be discussed in far greater detail at the, first and second supervision levels. And so it is with Christianity, right? So a pastor, for example, may have an overview of what members of the church are doing, but it will be individual small group leaders, Bible study leaders, who have more details about what's going on in members' lives and what challenges they may be facing, and how they are best equipped to do God's work.
Now, it's interesting, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Those of us who follow Ichthus and sort of its related ministries are not particularly fond of denominationalism, and it sounds like such a naughty term, a slur word, like what I would call extra biblical authority structures. I mean, you can just hear the pejorative sneer, right? This idea of maybe the structure imposed by like entities like the Roman Catholic Church, or even denominations. So like the Presbyterian Church has their like General Assembly, and then their decisions are like passed down to local, I don't know if they call them dioceses in the Presbyterian Church, but you get the idea, right? So very much like the military, which has their, 5-star generals and so on. And then you go down to majors and lieutenants and whatnot until you get down to the privates, the enlisted folks. Well, the Christian church actually doesn't have nearly so many levels of authority. And I don't think this changes the fundamental point you're making, right? But I would say within the local church, in terms of like formal authority, like you said, people who maybe run Bible studies, or just like, just because we're in a church with a bunch of different people doesn't mean that we're equally good friends with all of them, right? That doesn't mean that maybe we like some people better than others or anything like that. Just, like if there's 50 people in the church, maybe you're really good friends with like 7 of them, but not the other 43, just because we'll like only finite amount of time, right? So like some people will be more interconnected with each other, have that 500-foot view. But within the church itself, my understanding of church polity is that it mostly goes church congregants, then local pastor teacher, or I guess not local isn't the right word, like church congregants, pastor teacher, and then Christ himself as the head of the church. So there's only like 2 levels of authority, basically. And that's, of course, very different from the military, which has like a billion different levels of authority, right?
Yeah, there are many levels. And I think some denominations, and you touched on this, like extra biblical authority with maybe the Episcopal Church or the Catholic Church, they have other levels. So if you have a grievance, for example, there's a process by which you have to, make your grievance known. And
I mean, like you see why people tend towards this, because we have government bureaucracy. So why not do it in the church? See, the problem is that we have no scriptural support for any of it. In fact, I think there's this, I don't want to butcher it. I think there's a verse in Titus somewhere that talks about like not putting yourself under, like I said, I don't want to butcher it. I think there's something that suggests that it's a bad idea to essentially like have authority outside of the local congregation, of that person. I can find it if you're interested. But Ichthus has quite a bit on this. This actually is somewhat tangential to the study, right? But it sort of does give us this idea of, we're talking about the military analogy and the callings we have. Where I was going with the whole authority bit was more like, so, in the military, we have all these varied levels of authority, and everyone has their little scope, and information gets passed up the chain and everything like that. And really, for us as Christians, we're quite a bit more alike than most people in the military are, in terms of like I said, with only really the level of authority being pastor teachers between lay Christians and Christ himself. There's not nearly so many middle levels there. But like lots of ministries, lots of responsibilities.
Well, and as a follow-up, I would say, so there's great potential in ground level outreach. So in the case of the, Christianity, the Christian body, then small group of leaders, Bible study teachers, things like that, where you've got somebody maybe who's responsible for reaching out to a group of 5 or 10 people. And so they have the opportunity to get to know each individual on a personal level. And when I think about the gifts, going out into the community, first of all, you're making contact with somebody on a personal level, and it allows for that kind of leadership to connect to somebody in a way that takes advantage of one's unique gifts and experience. So I think about that, playing a critical role, because you would be able to connect to somebody in a way that I cannot connect to the person, and vice versa. So I really spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think it's important for every Christian, because, when we think about major decisions in life, career, marriage, where we live, family relations, then they're all affected by our spiritual gifts, and our ability to exercise those for the Christian body.
Yeah, I agree. But let's pull it back to alertness, right? So I think the point you were starting out with, how we sort of got onto this was, so I brought up the military metaphor when talking about alertness in general, and then you mentioned, hey, just like how the military has orders for people, so too do we as Christian have marching orders. So not that we were really that off topic, but an interesting point that your discussion brings up is this idea of, okay, so we have general, I don't know what the right word for it is, maybe like theological alertness, like, so we have this idea of not getting distracted by the things of the world, not giving into worldly thought patterns and anxiety about jobs and relationships and, I don't know, everything else that we worry about as Christians, or getting sidetracked by entertainment and, football tribalism and, the other sorts of things that humans chase after for pleasure and entertainment. And so if we keep our eyes fixed on things above and our minds on spiritual things, like that's one component of the alertness we're called to. However, I think your point brings up the idea that there's also, like, we need to be in tune not only with just like the general overview principles we're called to as Christians, but we also need to be in tune with the things that we individually are called to, right? And that really is somewhat of a different consideration. So people who have roles and responsibilities in a certain area in the church, like, while it's important for them to sort of keep the godly perspective, tune out the distractions of the world, keep their eyes focused on what we're called to as Christians. Another component of alertness is sort of taking care to make sure that they like essentially keep up with what they personally are called to. So like being alert in their own calling, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense. Let's see what was posted in the chat.
I think I get what you're saying is to not only know one's calling, but to act on it and to actively apply it.
Yeah. I mean, and they're not like completely distinct, right? Because our personal ministries completely flow out of, our spiritual growth as Christians and the test that we passed to get there. I mean, and I don't want to say I'm shooting from the hip. Like I agree with what I've just said, but like that's not a point I think directly made in the study, right? Most of what is discussed in this section is focused on sort of the godly perspective, what I would say at the higher general level. So like this paragraph here talking about, these are all these things right here are things that can sort of get us off the rails, right? These are things that people spend time thinking about and worrying about that sort of, even if some of them are benign as far as it goes, maybe they're not overtly sinful in themselves, at least they're distracting. And anything that takes away from our higher mission and calling ultimately is going to sort of put a film in front of our eyes and distract us, right? It reduces the alertness level that we have. It makes us lose focus of, sort of the crystallized clarity of this is what we're here for. This is what we do as Christians. This is what's real and spiritual and important versus sort of the illusionary siren song of the world, right? Like it makes us lose perspective.
It clouds our long-term view, I think.
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, when you think about it, this is an analogy I love using, right? So when we study economics, we have the idea of like short-term gain and long-term gain, right? And when we think of, the perspective that we're supposed to have as Christians, right? Our short-term and long-term, can be spoken of in terms of eternity, right? And when you think of eternal gain, this is what Paul calls the weight of glory, right? Like anything that has eternity as a variable, simply by its nature, is infinite, right? And so delayed gratification is already hard for us as humans. I want this thing now versus I want it 2 years in the future. But when you think of eternal delayed gratification, right? I mean, this is one of the very thing that I don't want to call it a trick, but something we need to like train ourselves into that's very difficult for us as humans. As Christians, we know that ultimately what's important is not this life, but what comes after, right? And so, delaying all of the positive things, we know as Christians we're going to face tests and trials, and by the Bible pretty much straight up tells us that as Christians our lives will probably be harder on earth, because God will be tempering us, testing our faith as his children, um, disciplining us, as a loving father. Unbelievers don't face any of that, right? So there's if you're interested in the distinction I'm making here, I think this is like the second thing in the Peter series on ichthys. Maybe this one here. So yeah, there's general human suffering. So think like disease, natural disasters and stuff. And then there's the suffering that believers face. So this one is like testing, like think Job. And then this is divine discipline for the sin we have. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that like it's such a hard thing for us, but we as Christians, like the entire point of the Christian life is delaying the benefits that we have, right? Like the rewards we have for submitting to God and doing things his way and all that comes about in eternity. And we may not reap all that much of that in this life. And that's one of the things that's really difficult for us. And something that we have to constantly be on guard about is keeping that perspective in mind. Because as soon as we start looking sideways at the pleasures of the world and thinking, hey, you know what, I want that, we're going to get off track and lose sight of the infinity that's tipping the scale very far the other way.
I agree. The short-term and long-term goals that people are thinking about in this world are dwarfed by eternal goals.
Mm-hmm.
With that, I'm going to sign off, Stephen. I'm very interested in this topic, so I'll follow up with you, I think.
All right, yeah, I'll try to post it. Actually, I guess I didn't post last week's either, did I? Okay, bad on me. Yeah, I'll post it, and then you can catch up.
All right.
Let's do it. We'll see where we go after this.
All right, great. Thank you.
All right, talk to you later, John. Okay, so Abby, you still there?
Yep, still here.
All right, so it's just us at the moment. I guess Audie is probably still tied up. Well, shall we keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so, well, we got a little bit on tangents there, but I think we hit this idea of spiritual momentum reasonably well, right? And this, like I said, I don't think this point was directly made in this section, but definitely something that shows up on Ichthus in multiple places, this idea that sort of you're either with God or against God, and there's no in between. The lukewarm believers get spewed out of his mouth, as Revelation puts it. This next point here, again, I'm just sort of abstracting out specific parts of the study. Like these aren't things of my own creation. I'm sort of just copy pasting interesting or things that I found interesting and entitling them. This verse here in Colossians or in Philippians is always something I found very interesting. Like what are the things listed in this verse, right? So we know that there is the spiritual aspect of things we're supposed to focus on in our lives. So things related to spiritual growth and Bible study and things like that. But what are these other things that are true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, of good repute, excellence, worthy of praise? Like, what are these things? Yeah, I'm curious. I don't think I have a strict answer, but what do you think? I don't mean to put you on the spot either. Like, I'm not sure there is a right answer.
I think it like means like anything that I think is happening in the world that's like bringing peace to people, not distracting from God, but like, nothing that's not overtly evil is probably, think about it, focus on it. Like, don't, because you know how humans have a tendency to focus on the negative all the time. Like this went wrong, that went wrong. And we ignore like all the good things in the world. So I think that's something the devil tries to do to us. Like he's always trying to make us seem like, trying to make it seem like there's no hope. Yeah. That things are worse than it is. So like, I think that's maybe what this is about.
I've always thought, I don't want to be blasé about it, but you know how people like share those uplifting videos on YouTube, like maybe kids putting on like a play that is sort of like not good acting, but the heartfelt intent just lifts up your day, right?
Yeah.
Or people sharing videos of people playing with puppies, or I don't want to make it sound like it's all cutesy and rainbows, right? But like things that are positive and uplifting and of good moral value, right?
Right.
Also I've often, I don't know if I'm just like a hopeless romantic or whatever, but just think of like medieval ideals of like chivalry and so forth, right? Like,
yep.
What true and honorable and lovely and so on, like the old-fashioned ideals of being honorable and just, and I don't know, like fighting against evil and whatnot. And again, I don't want to make this into, I don't know, something it's not, something that's almost like cheesy, right? Like it's not cheesy. This verse is like dead serious in what it's getting at, right? That what fills our thoughts and minds, and I do think, by the way, that like spiritual growth and stuff is part of this, right? Like Paul is not excluding that when he's saying this, but it is broader than that, right? It sort of reminds me, I think it's in Timothy somewhere, where Paul says something along the lines of like, physical exercise, maybe not exercise, like I'll just say exercise. You know what I mean? Like physical exercise is of some benefit, but like the spiritual component is of so much more. I'm butchering the paraphrase, but
yeah, like the athletes
always,
run for like the perishable crown, but we run for the
so it's probably 1 Corinthians 9, right? That's where.
Yeah.
You know what? Let me look it up. There's no reason for me not.
It's actually he's probably said the same thing in two different places. I think it might be.
I know the perishable, imperishable crown. That's 1 Corinthians 9.
Yeah.
I don't remember if what I'm thinking of is in the same chapter, but no, actually, I'm pretty sure it's in 1 Timothy somewhere. Like I could like 4-wall exercises. It's nice to be able to just Google things. And yeah, see, 1 Timothy 4. So for physical training is of some valuable, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come, right? So where I was going with this was that, so it sort of seems like Paul's dissing physical training here, but when you think about it, he's saying it's of some value, right? How many things in life do we have a divine stamp of approval on that they're of at least some value, right? Like very few, actually. Like coming from scripture, things that you can spend your time on that aren't directly related to spiritual growth, that have anything positive said about them, right?
Yeah.
And so again, I mean, and I don't think we need to like read too much into it. So I think that exercise is something you can count here. And probably not exercise done out of the wrong motivations. So, you know, vanity, wanting to attract people of the opposite sex, things like that. But you know, like keeping your body in good shape as a temple of the Holy Spirit to help you maintain your health and energy levels and whatnot, so you can be a more effective soldier in the body of Christ. Like that sort of motivation definitely falls here, right? Now, an area, and you know, I kind of am interested to hear what Audie has to say about this. If I'm not going to delay it until it gets here, but an area that I've seen brought up all the time with regards to this verse and the concept of thinking about sort of higher things. So there's two things, right? Philosophy and art. And both of these things in like medieval Christianity, like you sort of got worshipped more than they should have, right? So, you know, we call the blending of theology and philosophy theosophy, right? And that's not like a positive term, like that has negative connotations. You know, angels dancing on the head of a pin, right? So think Thomas Aquinas. A lot of really sort of pointless debate over philosophical questions that have no practical spiritual value, right? And maybe it's just the circles I ran in. You know, when I was in college, I went to a house church, and there were a lot of what I would call intellectuals, or I don't want to say self-styled because that makes them sound really stuck up, but you know, people who liked the intellectual bent on things, right? And so there was lots of discussion about philosophy. Philosophy was this great positive thing, and they would think it was true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and so forth, right? That this was this pursuit as Christians that is worthy. And art was the same way. Now, I have to confess that I'm a complete Philistine when it comes to art. You know, I appreciate some of the aesthetic qualities of it, but Dr. Luganbill talks about this in various places about how art is essentially mimesis. It's imperfectly copying reality to emphasize certain things, right? So art is fundamentally a lie. I don't like to get all like preachy about it, but a lot of people have this idea that art is like, particularly like, is there a nice way to say this? Like highbrow art, like the stuff that intellectuals sit at and like, and ponder the, I don't know, like the great mystery of the universe or whatever. You know, like they'll sit there and look classy and intellectual by talking about the deeper significance in the abstract modern painting. I mean, I don't want to just completely strawman. I think you know what I'm talking about. And so philosophy and art, I mean, I don't want to just throw those things under the bus in particular, but I think there's a lot that Christians focus on that they think is what this verse is getting at that is of no value whatsoever. It's complete garbage in the face of what we're called to as Christians. And, you know, So, I mean, I didn't mean to get a super off topic on this verse. You know, there's another verse from Colossians that phrases this here as thinking on like the things of above, right? Set your mind on the things above, not the things that are on earth. So, you know, like the point that's being made here is that all these other things that absorb the worries and the wow, my brain is frozen. Conscious attention, I guess that's not an elegant way of putting it, but like it sort of captures the minds and interests of unbelievers, aren't of much value, and they lead to a vulnerability if we focus on them, because we're sort of taking our eyes off the combat, the spiritual combat that's around us, that's of ultimately that's how reality is, and sticking it on sort of the illusions of the world. And we lose sight of our goal, and we lose sight of all the threats in front of us and things like that, right? So are you familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave?
Yes.
Yes. So I always, you know, Plato, of course, is not is not what we'd call Christian, and there is this dangerous tendency among some early Christian philosophers who really liked Plato to, I think they sort of Christianized him a little bit.
I think too, like, okay, so if this is kind of my theory on that. So if wisdom comes from God, when men seriously start to sit down and like ponder wisdom, even if they've never heard the gospel, or, you know, they're not familiar with, you know, the law or anything like that, I think like they get really close to like the things they figure out is God's law. Like the things they figure out matches God's wisdom, even though God's not, you know, they're not reading the Bible or reading scripture.
I mean, this
or
sounds like Paul in Romans. I think it's Romans.
like,
3,
you know what I'm saying?
Like,
Like,
talks about how Gentiles are a law unto themselves, right?
well, yeah, well, how you have, yeah, morality written on your heart. And like, I think when you have really great thinkers like Plato, and even like if you look at Buddhism, the Buddha, like a lot of the things that he talks about, like his life kind of reminds me like a mix of Job and a mix of, like he had like an experience where he was born really rich and he had everything he wanted and he wasn't happy. So then he went out and lived like a beggar, really poor. Not necessarily Job, not necessarily King Solomon, but kind of. You know, he had both experiences, and then he kind of came up with this wisdom, and his wisdom
it's
very similar
called wisdom literature, right? There's an entire genre of this. I wrote a paper on this when I was in my classics degree. This idea of traveling holy men. There's this guy. Wow, I shouldn't have forgotten. This is reflecting poorly on my college education. Like a traveling holy man. You know, I could look it up if you're actually interested. But you know, self-styled people who wrote about the wisdom that they gained from their experiences in life and things like this. In fact, where I was going with this Plato's, I mean, I didn't mean to get us sidetracked on the value of philosophy and other writings and so on. Where I was going with Plato's allegory of the cave was that I found it eminently helpful in explaining Satan's world system, right?
Yep.
Because if people are at all familiar with philosophy, then you just say, okay, so in Plato's allegory of the cave, right, the shadows on the wall, well, that's like the worldly concerns, right? And the ultimate reality, right? So the cave is the cosmos, the politics and all the anger and, you know, the political movements around us, and the things people worry and spend time on, those are all shadows on the cave wall, right? We're chained in place. We think that's reality. That's not reality at all. And then, of course, the outside world, where the light of the sun, right? That's spiritual reality. And so Plato makes the point in his allegory of the cave that if you go into the light and you try to pull other people into the light, well, they'll be blinded and squint and they won't be able to see anything. And then they'll say that you're foolish, right? And they use so-called cave logic to reason with you to why you're foolish, right? That's exactly how unbelievers operate, right? So it's a very clean parallel to my mind about sort of the spiritual realities, right? And of course, Plato wasn't really using his illustration there as an argument in favor of Christianity, but you know, like it works very well in illustrating the problem for sort of how the world operates, right? You know, I took this philosophy class when I was at Georgia Tech that was focused on the influence of science and technology on human values, right? A very interesting class. But the class was hyper cynical. You know, we influence media systems and political systems and how they bias people and things like that. So if I wasn't cynical before I took that class, I was very cynical after I took it. And so, of course, the Matrix is very similar to Plato's allegory of the cave, right? I mean, with robots and guns and so forth. But the term that my professor used that comes from the Matrix is talking about how we live in the desert of the real, right? And sort of this barren wasteland that people are unwilling to say, they're unwilling to concede that that's how the world actually is. So instead, we set up these illusions around us for the purpose of comforting us so we don't have to face reality, right? And when you look at how a lot of people view the world, this is how unbelievers live their lives, right? Dr. Luganville calls it myth happiness, right? They're chasing after stability in their career, income, attractive spouse, 2.5 kids and the dog and the white picket fence, right? And that's what they chase after. And it's all an illusion to numb them to the reality of death and impending divine judgment, right? Natural revelation 101. So I don't want to get super off topic here, but I've always really liked Plato's allegory of the cave to help explain what I think the sentiment behind this verse in Colossians of thinking of things above and these things that are true and honorable and right and so forth, is that these are not the illusions on the cave wall, but walking out into the sunlight, right? Grasping how the world really works, the actual forces at play, not getting sucked in hook, line, and sinker by the lies of the world, but sort of transcending that. And I don't want to sound like a hippie here, but I mean, just rising above some of the fray, right? Staying a little bit aloof to it and letting the world sort of chase after its things while you take a step back with some perspective and say, you know what, all of this is sort of vain and stupid, and I'm not going to play the game. I'm going to focus on, ideals such as like love and truth and kindness and virtues like that, where we make an attempt to live moral lives ourselves and then help other people get there as well. I mean, of course, none of this is divorced from our mission as Christians, right? So we needn't be completely philosophically distance ourselves from the religion aspect of this.
Yeah.
But that sort of ideal thinking in terms of ideals and virtues and so forth, and sort of stepping above the fray. Honestly, I mean, not to get off into philosophy, but the Stoics, so think like Marcus Aurelius, again, not Christian by any means, but some pretty good ideas relating to sort of keeping the world at arm's length, right? And then you can go too far with this. Monasticism takes it way too far, and they pull out of the world entirely, even though, in fact, I think this, I don't know, did I pull it here? No, I think it's, let me see how good my memory is. No, I think it's 510. Maybe it's 1510. Yeah, right? So here, let me find the wider context here. Not to associate with sexually immoral people. I was not including the sexually immoral of the word or the greedy and slanderous idolater case. In that case, you'd have to leave the world, right? And so this right here, even though Paul doesn't say it in so many words, commands us not to leave the world, right? So he's talking about how we as Christians should refuse to associate with people who claim to be Christian and have outrageously immoral behavior, right? So in 1 Corinthians 5, this was the man, I think he was sleeping with his mother-in-law or something, or maybe his stepmother. Yeah, stepmother. And Paul, hands him over to Satan, right? Hands him over to the sin unto death. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
And so Paul, in this verse, sort of makes the point that we can't, if we want to escape people who are the quote unquote sexually immoral of this word and the greedy swindlers and idolaters, right? That's the default state of unbelievers. Like, we would have to completely remove ourselves from the world if we were to avoid that. But rather, that's not what we're called to. And so in our thoughts of thinking on higher things and stepping back from the chaos of the world and things like that, right? You know, people throughout history, I think, have taken this to the wrong extreme and said, you know what, I'm going to go be a monk in the desert and, find spiritual transcendence or whatever. um, and in fact, the church idolizes these people, right? I don't know how familiar you are with like patristic scholars and like the, I don't want to butcher things. There were called like the desert fathers, right? These people who were supposedly really wise, see, Wikipedia article.
I've never heard of this before.
Well, I mean, it's not a good, I'm not putting this forward as something that you ought to spend lots of time on.
Just like monastic communities in
Yeah,
general.
well, I mean, but taken to the level of like spiritual enlightenment, right? So
Yeah.
not quite the level of like, achieving nirvana and like the Eastern thoughts about it, but a whole lot more that direction than most Christianity, right? And that is taking this idea right here in this verse and twisting it to the wrong extreme. And the things above, right? So as I often said, you want to keep your eyes upcast, but not so upcast that you run into things in front of you, right? And maybe that's being a little bit clever, but the point is, we're not supposed to have our heads so far in the clouds that we fail to function as, capable adults in this world. We still have our responsibilities, not only to our families, particularly if we're married and we have children, but also just to be a good witness in the world, so be a good witness to our, siblings and parents and coworkers and so forth. And we can't do that if we're so focused on like, what's the best way to put it? Like maybe chasing the idea of things that we miss the point. So I don't need to yammer on this anymore. These verses here about thinking on things above and thinking on, whatever is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and so forth. All of this, it just goes to help us maintain the proper perspective, right? And this gets back into the momentum thing that we were mentioning earlier about how when we're not thinking about things like this, when we're not meditating on scripture or if not scripture directly, like application of it, how does this apply to my life? How ought I to live given that this is true, things like that. Or we're not thinking about things that are, right and true and lovely and pure and things like that, but we get tied up in the weeds of the world. We get tripped up. Our walk stumbles, we aren't alert, we're not on guard, and that's when bad things happen. And I think this leads well into this point here. So this is a paragraph from the study a little bit further down where Dr. Luganville is talking about how essentially how like drifting, aimlessness is dangerous, right? Like it's a very dangerous place to be. So maybe I'll let you read it for a second. Or actually I can just read it out loud. So let me see, let's pick up. So aimless mental wandering, drifting, may not be sinful, but it has never accomplished anything positive in the spiritual life. Furthermore, once we are wandering, once our thought pattern is adrift, so to speak, then we become vulnerable to the waves, winds, and storms that life and the evil one are wont to send against us. Believers who are spiritually mature and walking day by day as they should, dedicating time to prayer, reading their Bibles, listening to Bible teaching, will prove difficult to swamp even so. But a happier state of affairs obtains when such weather finds us with sails already reefed and hatches battened down. So when we're aimless and adrift and sort of in a vapid state of not being alert, sort of just drifting to and fro, I'd say a good way of thinking about this state is just viewing the sheltered, pampered state of most people in America who have never really faced, well, I don't want to say like people as a group, but there's many people in our country who are completely unaware of how difficult life is for people outside of their bubble, right? That is drifting in aimlessness. And when we are in this state, so people flunking the prosperity test, I guess is what I'm getting at. We needn't throw just Americans under the bus, but anyone in the world who trusts in their wealth and security and possessions and sort of just, lives their life in leisure. The Romans had a word for it. They called it odium, like Otium. And basically dedicated philosophical treatises to the pursuit of leisure. Even if people don't go quite that far, when we're adrift like that, when we aren't focused on what we're here to do as soldiers for Jesus Christ, and we instead get the idea, I can laze around on a tropical island and drink my pina colada and, not have a care in the world, that sort of thing, we leave ourselves wide open to spiritual attack because we're not expecting it. We think, oh, life's good. I don't have to worry about things. And then boom, we get tripped up. And I put this here. I don't think the study mentioned it. I know Dr. Luganville talks about it other places on the site. This idea that, David's horrific affair with Bathsheba and having Uriah the Hittite sent to the front lines and murdered essentially, all of that would have been prevented if King David was leading his troops in battle as he should have been, right? So basically, he was being lazy, and he never would have seen Bathsheba if he was on the front lines where he was supposed to be. And that is the danger of aimlessness for us as Christians, is if we're on the battle lines where we ought to be, we won't face that risk. But if we're on top of the palace, as King David was, like strolling around in the evening with, sort of without the battle that we're called to on our minds, that's when we see Bathsheba and we do all the bad things. So, thoughts?
The whole thing with Bathsheba and David, if you think about it, it's really, it is really, really horrible.
Sure. And David faced 14 years of severe divine discipline for it. Maybe there's a tendency for people to think, oh, David got off easy. I don't know. But he lost the unborn child, right? And then basically his entire family rebelled against him, right?
Yeah.
And we read about, David did not
his daughter got raped by his son.
Yeah. I don't know. I think people maybe tend to forget that David himself didn't die here, but he faced an incredibly difficult, it's not like David's life was all peachy before this either.
No.
But he faced quite a bit of divine discipline for this decision.
Well, it always makes me wonder, what was Bathsheba's involvement in this? Did she know that he killed her husband?
We don't know.
Did she care?
I will say that Bathsheba shows up in the genealogies, just how Ruth and Rahab does.
Yeah, but there's one point where they don't mention her name, though. They say I can't remember where it is. They say Solomon's mother. They don't actually say her name.
Euphemism? I don't know.
Something it's a way to
I'm sure the biblical studies people write papers on this, right?
Yeah.
But I've always taken it as no. This is, by the way, this is one of the strongest points. This is going to sound a little off topic here. You know how there's some of those people, Dr. Luganville will get people emailing him who say, remarriage after divorce is sinful. So those people who got married, now they should split up and go back to their initial spouses. Do you know
right.
what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It always makes me think of this, right?
Yep.
Where, of course, what David did was completely horrific, right? And no one is arguing that David did the right thing here, right? And that this adultery was okay or anything like that, right? But even so, even after murdering her husband, King Solomon and David's kingly line ultimately came through Bathsheba, right?
Yeah.
And how is that evidence of anything else that once a marriage is in place, no matter the circumstances that came about before it, once it's in place?
Well, it's also it's like Rachel and Leah. I was thinking of that. So I was thinking of my sister. I have a little sister. And I was thinking, what if that happened to me? What if I was stuck in a marriage and had to share a husband with my sister? That is just so, and I don't know, if Jacob, I don't know if Jacob had to do that. I don't know if that's just the culture, if he could have, married Leah off to someone else or what he could have done, but I have no idea. But like,
Honestly, I always felt
relation
really
is
bad
so
for Leah.
nasty. It's
You know,
horrible.
we think about it, and so in the way that most men are, right? Jacob was interested in Rachel mostly because she was pretty.
Right. Yeah.
By all accounts, Rachel was, if not, don't come at me with pitchforks. There's questions to whether she was even saved, right?
Yeah,
Whether or
yeah.
not she
She's
brings the
definitely
idols with
like,
her, right?
yeah,
Like, at the very least, she's not portrayed as particularly spiritually mature, right?
right.
And when
And
you
there's
look
not
at,
much said about Leah either, but like,
well,
I mean,
sure,
Leah
but
does
to be fair,
God
she prayed to God, right?
Yeah.
And God gave her a son, right? So there's a degree to which she at least trusted God enough to pray to.
Well, and so did Rachel, though. I'm pretty sure Rachel like prayed after she saw Leah having babies. Like, I mean, they both. I don't know, but yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, it seems like
I have
Rachel.
to check the verses myself. I mean, where I was going with this though was
Yeah.
that Leah really got the short end of the stick here, right? Some of it is cultural too. We have this huge cultural aversion, not to get us more off topic than we already are, right? But like the idea of arranged marriage just rubs us completely the wrong way, whereas it's completely normal for billions of people on the planet still to this day.
Yeah.
Like, that's a culture thing. That's not a, Joseph and Mary's marriage was arranged, okay?
Right.
Like, and by all accounts, it was a happy, loving marriage. We tend to put blinders on when it comes. Part of this is that I'm not going to say, this is one area where I still sort of need to talk to Dr. Luganville more. I haven't picked his brain on it that much.
I've got a lot of like
a little bit anti-romance is what I would say, and I don't know if that's my perception, and maybe that's incorrect. But we have the Song of Solomon in Scripture, right? So it's not like romance is entirely a foreign thing to us, and it's not like bad and evil. But people marrying for what we would consider romantic love, we don't have a great deal of like examples in the Bible about that, right?
I don't know. Like, it's like Rebecca and Isaac seemed like they really loved each other. And say what you will about the Jacob situation, Jacob continued to love Rachel. I mean, he really did. That's why he treated Joseph so much better.
Well, sure, and it's why he was so broken later on, right?
Like, you kind of see it in the Bible. You don't see it like it's kind of like one of those between the lines things, like in the Bible.
Okay. But I will point out that Jacob's love for Rachel over Leah basically caused his brothers to sell Joseph into slavery, or rather caused Joseph's brothers.
I don't know about that. That might have contributed to it, but you remember God was giving Joseph those dreams too. Like, so even if he wasn't favored.
Okay, to be fair to Joseph's brothers, if I don't have a little brother, I have a little sister, but if I did have a little brother, I can imagine how snot-nosed he'd be, because my best friend growing up had a little brother, right? And if my little brother came and started talking about sheaves of wheat bowing to him and stuff, I don't want to say I'd stick him in a hole and sell him into slavery, but, I wouldn't be thinking happy thoughts.
Right.
So I sort of understand where they were coming from. Of course, what they did was wrong, but, anyway, not to get us super duper off topic, but what were we even talking about before this? I was making some point.
I can't remember, but we were talking about like giving into just being lazy spiritually, and that's how this stuff leads to. It leads to this. But I wanted to say one more thing too about the David Bathsheba thing. When Nathan gives David, so this is what's interesting about adultery, because it was weird. I was listening. I have like the Bible. I just have random like on my iPod. Like, I'll listen to music, but I'll have like, it'll play Bible verses too, because I have like the audio Bible on my iPod. Yeah. And I was just sitting stretching before my run last night, and it started to play. I think it's Mark 10, where Jesus is telling the Pharisees about, divorce and how, Moses let you divorce your wives because your hearts were hardened. And that's where he said, and that's that one part where he says, if a man divorces his wife, he forces her to commit adultery, and vice versa, which is where those people get that, when they argue with Dr. Luganville about they think you should go back to the spouse you divorced. But that was weird, because that came on last night while I was stretching. I was listening to it. And then I was thinking of like, so Nathan, and again, this is like way off topic, but when Nathan was talking to David and trying to show David what he did, the whole parable about the man eating his like taking the little sheep and eating it and slaughtering it. Mm-hmm. Like, it was funny. Okay, so David had, in a roundabout way, he really did have Uriah murdered.
Yeah.
But Nathan didn't bring that up. Like Nathan didn't come out and say you murdered Uriah, or he didn't because David probably knew what he did there.
Yeah.
Like Nathan pointed out to David how horrible the adultery was. That's what is interesting. Like it's almost like God is saying that the adultery is worse than the murder, which is, adultery is not worse than murder, but it's funny that that's the focus.
Sin is sin, right? But when you think about it, also it really paints Bathsheba in a more innocent light. Right, we have nothing to go on. We don't know how Bathsheba felt about any of this. We don't know if she was. I mean, there is a certain extent to, again, culturally, we don't have kings. Okay, like our entire culture rebels against the notion. But in a culture, in the Eastern cultures like this, I mean, Far East, like think Persia, kings were gods. Okay, like straight up worshipped. Yeah. When the king tells you come to my bed, you don't say no.
Exactly. So, right. Like, you don't know what she.
Right. We don't know how she felt about all of this. Right. But she is portrayed in Nathan the prophet's, statements to David. She's portrayed as the lamb. Right.
Yeah. Like a victim.
Okay. Lambs universally seen as blameless victims. Okay.
Right.
So,
I think it's interesting how it's people. I think people nowadays, like people get upset about adultery, but they think of it as like, oh, he's just a jerk, or oh, he just cheated on me. But like the Bible, if you look at it, like Nathan is pretty much, he's equating adultery to like murder. He is equating that relationship has been murder.
Not that the Jews ever followed the law particularly, but adulterers got stoned, right? They were put to death. And nowadays, if someone sleeps with your wife, I mean, regardless of how consenting she was, and you shoot him out of jealousy, you're charged with first-degree murder.
Right.
There were times
adultery is a misdemeanor in some states. Did you know that?
Is it really?
Yeah, in the state of Virginia, I think you have to pay a $250 fine, and then there's some states where I think there's 5 states in the union where it's if like you're a wife and your husband commits adultery, with another woman, you can sue that other woman for money for destroying your marriage. You can sue her for everything you're.
America never ceases to surprise me.
Yeah.
I mean, adultery used to be straight up illegal, and think Hester Prynne, Scarlet Letter. Okay.
Yeah.
And in the times of the
you could burn out the stake for
America. Yeah. I mean, there was much more of an adultery is illegal sort of thing. I mean, not to get us, off topic, right? I mean, and so we've wandered far. We got there with David and Bathsheba, right? But the point of all this is that when we let ourselves drift aimlessly, when we aren't on top of things spiritually and moving forward and progressing, that's when we see Bathsheba on the roof, right? And I again, this is one of my, I like to explain some of these concepts in metaphors and analogies. Not to get off topic again, but I mean, I think it really helps make the points hit home to people, right? Like it's a little bit abstract sometimes. And then you use the analogy and then it clicks, right? And so I was doing this with the military metaphor earlier, and I'm doing it with David and Bathsheba here, right? When we think of the circumstances of our lives, and then we think of wandering about on the roof, seeing a beautiful woman bathing, right? Like we can, it clicks, right? It helps us put into context, put into focus. That's what aimless wandering for Christians is, right? It gives us the opportunity to fall into sin, right? And then you have that point of reference. And for me, that's how I remember things, right? Because I can sort of academically, intellectually, in an abstract sort of way say, not moving forward as Christians, just drifting can potentially lead to sin. And head knowledge, I can sort of intellectually appreciate that. But until I get that example of David and Bathsheba, and I go, oh, that's what it means, right? And then I have that example that just, boom, pops into my mind. And that's the severity of it, right? That's how serious it can be.
Yep. So one thing too, for modern Christians, I think a big way of giving into this, the apathy, is just, I do this. And I notice I do it when I'm tired. I have to kind of remind myself, if I'm really tired or I need to eat or something, I just need to go take a nap or just go to bed for the day. Cause if I don't have any mental energy to do anything Bible study or language study or whatever, I'll just sit and scroll on Facebook or Instagram. Yep. And then I'll start to see things that lead me to click on other things. And then by the time, 2 hours have gone by and I've been sitting on my phone doing nothing.
Or, I mean, the internet is bad like this, and Dr. Luganville calls it out explicitly in the study, right? That that, and you got to be careful because there's a lot of saber rattling by, conservative Christians, like the homeschooling crowd tends to be like anti-technology, right?
Yeah.
Like the internet is evil, ebooks are evil. I don't want to get on that. Like I know some people like reading books. I do all my Bible study on the computer. I use cross references a lot. It's way more efficient objectively, etc. Like I'm not going to go there, but the internet itself, though, and social media in particular, is incredibly distracting, right? And if I try to make a point of this for myself. I'm still failing in some sense. Like I have filters set up, technology filters. Like I can block web access if I want to, or if I want to be working on like a project or something, I can block access to all but a few websites. Like if I'm programming or whatever, like I'll still allow myself access to Wikipedia and Stack Overflow and stuff if I need to look something up. But like I can limit what I'm doing. And so I try to always have a purpose in mind when I'm on my computer. Because if I don't, boom, hours gone, right? And, it can be as innocuous as, just to give an example, right? And this will showcase my personality. When I was in college, one of the ways I would procrastinate I would just research things I was interested in. So I know a ridiculous amount about like medieval warfare and weapons. I mean, it's just, I like military history. I thought it was interesting. And now I can tell you an awful lot about like the difference between pikes and short spears and long swords and military formations and cavalry and so forth. And it's not useful information, right? But I would just, when I had to write a paper or had a project or whatever, and I didn't want to do it, I would just read stuff about that instead. And of course, and sometimes it's more pernicious, right? Sometimes it's more problematic, outright sinful things. The internet, more bandwidth is spent streaming pornography than almost anything else on the internet, right? It's just a fact. And so it's not just time wasting. There are opportunities to sin. I mean, heck, and so pornography is probably a more universal struggle, at least for men, but there's even darker stuff than that on the internet, right? The dark web, human trafficking, drugs, like, and of course, technology is always like this, right? It's dualistic. It can be used for good. It can be used for evil. Because we also have Khan Academy and free education being given to people who wouldn't otherwise have it. And, FaceTiming your grandma and stuff like this, right? So internet technology, not inherently evil, but it is extremely dangerous to use aimlessly. And that's where I was going with this, is that, I'm self-aware enough to know this about myself, that I have to be really, really careful to be on my computer if I don't have a specific goal in mind. Because if I am, it just 2 or 3 clicks away, you see something, your mind goes to the gutter, boom, it's over. Or you get distracted by something, you've wasted 2 hours, you had to get something done, you end up shortchanging sleep or whatever. And like, it's a huge problem. And I don't know if this is a gender thing. I do think men struggle with some of this more than women. But like, just keeping focus on it can be extremely difficult. So I don't know.
Are you talking about more like the porn and the?
Yeah,
like,
right. Like men.
It's definitely more of a like. There are women that are addicted to that too. Don't get me wrong, but like, it's more of a male thing for sure.
Well, psychology backs us up. Like visual cortex stuff. Men are just more visual sexually.
Well, but I'll spend like hours. Like
that's not.
I'll spend hours crying and being anxious about like worrying about a husband though. Like it's not sexual sin, but it's still like I'm
pick
still
your poison, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No one gets off easy. So I didn't mean to derail us onto this, but this is the Bathsheba for men on the internet. It just always has been. It's unfair. Some people don't struggle with it as much, right? Our culture makes it very difficult to not be exposed to sexual influence just in general, right? Like you can't even walk down the street without, more on display than you would otherwise probably want people to have, right?
Oh yeah, there's just like billboards, with just pretty almost full nudity nowadays. Or you just like you watch TV and like the family channels, just the stuff that's on like ABC Family. Like I'm just like, are you serious?
Yeah.
I don't know. Or even the Disney Channel.
In the world, but not of the world, right?
Right.
It's a constant challenge, and how much more so when we're not walking securely. Because I find if I'm like on a spiritual high, if I'm doing well, doing what I ought to do, it's simply like I noticed someone, walking near me, and my mind registers, oh, she's very attractive, and then the next second my eyes slip away because I'm not going there. Like
Right.
it's not hard if you're doing things correctly. Like you just simply acknowledge these things, and then your lever switches in your brain, and you're like, okay, cool, and then
Well,
like
a lot of like
normal,
too,
right?
like it's like you said, it's a cultural thing too. Like I know like a lot of women in our culture, they like show their cleavage, and a lot of sometimes women will do that to like be more beautiful, but then sometimes women just do it because like a lot of the clothes that they design, are very low cut. Like I actually have trouble finding things sometimes to wear that are high cut.
Sure.
And then like funny after I got
to me about pants. Okay, they were complaining that they couldn't find jeans that weren't tight, and they were just like, I want comfortable jeans. Why doesn't anyone make comfortable jeans for women that don't like hug their legs, particularly up towards
right.
the hips,
Yeah.
And it's just like, I was like, sorry, I'm a guy, I can't sympathize, but
yeah, it's just it's our culture. But like, and I definitely have gotten a lot. Not like I have gotten spiritual discipline from God with showing cleavage. Like, and that was kind of at the beginning when I first got back into my faith and was reading Dr. Luganville's site. And since then, like he really like reminds me to keep myself covered up. And it's more of like I'm not trying to do it, but like if you're at the gym and you don't have the right kind of bra on, like you could, like when you're doing, bending down and doing exercises, you can easily, show things.
A lot of it, I don't want to be legalistic about it either.
Right.
This is one of the problems, is that ultimately people's lust, that's for them to keep under control. It doesn't mean, the thing is like Romans 14 wise, okay? Like if we have the opportunity to make it easier for our brothers and sisters, like we probably ought to, right?
Right.
It's one of the reasons why beaches are so hard for Christians.
Yeah. But then you have to think, like, from like a woman's perspective too, like, and this is like a big feminist point too, like they always, like in high school, like they would say girls aren't allowed to have spaghetti strap t-shirt or like tank tops in high school or whatever. And it's like the reason is, and I agree, like in a high school, yeah, I mean girls should be covered up. They shouldn't be showing their stomachs. They shouldn't have Daisy Dukes on, or like shorts that are showing riding up on, like they should be like modest. But like there's been like cases of in our country where like a man's like, and this is again probably also in like Islamic countries too, where it's like unless like a woman's like covering her whole body, it's like, oh well, she's making men lust after her. And it's like at some point, like where do you
it's cultural
draw the line, right?
We always made fun of the sonnets about this, that mention like ankles and whatnot.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Like,
yeah.
Oh, the scandal. It's our culture shows more skin than basically any culture ever before, right?
Yeah.
It's just, and I was having an interesting conversation with someone about this earlier. What about nude beaches in Europe, or at least topless beaches, right? That's a thing in like some countries like Spain and France.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to like throw shade on Europe.
Well, here in Columbus we have, it's called Comfest. It's like a hippie. It's really hippie-ish. There's a lot of like the more like super liberal people come out, and it's big for like women just walking around topless. You'll see it.
Isn't that illegal in most places in America though?
Apparently not in Columbus, Ohio during Comfest.
Okay.
Doesn't happen.
Yeah, but I mean, where I was going with this was that there are places. You see, the thing is that for us as Americans, where that's not culturally acceptable, or it's seen as titillating and scandalous, like it's not okay, right?
Right.
In places where maybe it is culturally, like I wouldn't want to sit there on my high horse and say, oh, those people are being sinful and they're just leading men on or whatever. Like it's not my place.
Right.
But the whole point of all this, and again, to pull us back to the topic, is if we're paying attention on this. So this is both from the perspective of people attempting to, I guess, make things easier for our brothers and sisters in Christ, and those attempting to not fall into sin.
Right.
Being on guard about it, being on guard about what you wear, how you act. You would be amazed at some of the stuff I hear. Like men who think that women who put on makeup are like, there's no polite way to say it. They think that they're being slutty, right?
Oh yeah, people have written to Dr. Luganville about that. Have you read some of those?
I mean, it just blows my mind. Like,
yeah.
Like, who doesn't want to be beautiful? I mean, like, or here's the other thing, right? I'm not a girl. I don't understand female psychology. I don't even pretend to. But girls' night out is a thing, right? And what do people do for girls' night out? they dress up and put on makeup and they want to look pretty, even if there's no guys involved, right?
Right.
Like, how can you call it
Most of what women
about,
do,
like,
putting on makeup, it's for other women, and it's a vanity thing, but it's also like,
well, but it's like
it's a cultural thing
fun,
too, because
right?
we
You know,
see
like, the
women.
8-year-olds who want you to do their hair and whatever,
Right.
you know,
I mean,
like.
makeup is fun, but like if you look at every single image a woman is exposed to of other women in magazines, billboards, TV, movies, like they're always wearing makeup. So like for us not to wear makeup, like for me, when I don't wear makeup, I feel like I'm a man who hasn't shaved or bathed for like 5 days. Like
I
I
mean,
feel
it's super unfair, right? You should
yeah.
have the conversation. My sisters complain all the time about, like, both my sisters wear jeans. Obviously, I don't want to get super personal here, but they don't like shaving their legs, and they think it's super unfair culturally that they have to do this and it's expected of them, and if they don't do it, it's seen as being like super edgy.
Yeah.
And they're just like, like, what? Like, this
Yeah.
isn't fair, you know? Like, and so most of the time they just wear jeans because they're like, eh.
Yeah. I'm lucky. I don't have like long leg hair, so I can get away with
we're
like.
Northern European.
But yeah, some women, it's like most women actually. It's like yeah, you have to do it all the time. But
yeah, well, if you want to wear shorts, at least. Otherwise,
right,
you have
exactly.
constant comments and bad negative attention. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess we're mostly German and Norwegian, so hairy Northern Europeans.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I've got some. Well, I think I do. I don't know. We'll have to like investigate it. But I think I've got some Native American in me. But like I've had people ask me if I shave my arms, but because I like you can't see. Like I don't have any. It's very light. But I don't know. So yeah, there's like it's so weird. Like there was something else.
Also, just like people interfering in all this, right? It's always a thing. And I know Dr. Luganbill is very careful in how he handles these things, right? So we have that verse in Peter that basically talks about how, like, the spiritual, oh God, I don't want to butcher it. Basically, like how physical appearance isn't important and the spiritual reality is way more important, right? And like Peter never straight up condemns like wearing jewelry either. That's the thing. Is that the whole point is that like that shouldn't be your main focus.
Right.
That shouldn't be what you find true beauty in. It doesn't mean you can't do it. Like
well,
it boggles my mind how legalistic people get about all
well,
this.
I've like been in the store like and where like I've been with other women and they see some woman with like this huge gaudy diamond ring on her finger, like big. Like and they're like, ooh, why is she wearing that? And I'm thinking, she probably just thought it was pretty. It's probably just a piece of costume jewelry and she thinks it's pretty. And like why do you even care? Like it's you know what I'm saying? Like
yeah,
I don't know.
Again, I don't understand female psychology, but
yeah.
I mean, men are just as bad, okay? Like, we don't do jewelry and stuff, but, ooh, why is he driving that car? Or, like, do you even lift, bro?
Yeah,
like, we're no better, okay? Like, we're different, but, and I say this coming from the experience of someone who didn't hit the gym until, like, the last 8 months or something, okay? Like, I get it. The social judgment and the pressure it's stupid. I mean, like, a good thing I just really stopped caring what people thought right about high school. But, like, all this is stuff that we're constantly bombarded with. We're constantly exposed to. Like, we can't even avoid it. Like, and so if we're not taking pains to keep the right perspective, we're going to get tripped up by it. Maybe we won't be the judgy people on the sideline gossiping about others, but it will get to us. I mean, I think this is especially dangerous for, like you were mentioning, women in our society who have these totally unrealistic, impractical standards of beauty shoved upon them all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's completely unfair, right? Because if they drop their guard for even a second, they're going to experience these feelings of inadequacy and feel down and emotional and, oh, I need to buy this to be beautiful or whatever. And
or just get insulted.
It's
like
just complete crap, and I don't understand. I mean, it's always rubbed me the wrong way, right? But the thing is, it's not even resisting against something obviously evil, right? And I think this is, we mentioned, I think it was last week, we were talking about how sometimes it's the little things that get us, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of this staying alert business and keeping the right spiritual perspective, we're not on guard against like people trying to kill us or, I don't know, like trying to convert us to some wacky like sex party thing or whatever. Like that's just completely over the top sinful, right? It's
where we live. Like maybe if we lived in like LA or something.
Okay, maybe there is that. But I mean, I'm talking about like general people.
Yeah,
right?
general.
What they're resisting against is the background cultural ideas about, say, beauty and what makes people like respected and valuable. Like what makes you valuable as a human being?
Yeah, and like I would think 90% of that comes from movies and TV that people watch, and like song lyrics.
It's completely wrongheaded. And yet, if they drop their guards, no one's immune to this either. Right? This is one of the unfortunate things. So, is Vulcan like as I tried to be? Right? I have no problems. I'm not trying to humble brag here. Like, I'm a pretty logical person. Like, people have made fun of me for it, right? That tried to sort of put logic first and ignore the emotions and do the right thing, even if I feel a certain way, or like that sort of thing, right? I consider myself to be pretty logical. And yet sometimes I still catch myself, getting sucked in by all this, right? If you just let your guard down for a second, you'll start buying into this crap about how you need to act a certain way or own a certain thing or make a certain amount of money or whatever, just to fit into to society and culture, right? So, we've made the point, we don't need to keep hammering it in, but we have to be on guard about all this all the time. And if we're not, then, like the foxes slip into the vineyard, right? That's from Song of Solomon, right? If we're not, we let these things slip through the cracks, it will catch up to us. You still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Well, Audie has dropped off, so maybe we'll call it soon. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
We've hit most of the points here. There's a lot more to say in the section, but we don't have to hit everything. I tend to, most of the time when he's quoting scripture directly, the points are reasonably straightforward. They're, like they follow from what he's quoting reasonably clearly, and so there's not as much to comment on, right?
Right. Oh yeah, Dr. Louisville's very thorough with his studies.
Well, we could of course talk about more too, but I sort of figure we don't have people here this week, so
right.
We'll post it and then see where we are next week.
Yeah, give them like a little bit to catch up on, but not go over a lot because they'd be missing out on a lot.
All right. Well, I'll cut the recording then.
Cool.